Hello, this is Mr. Salmingo. This is part 2 of the Science Section 2 review video. This particular slide now we're talking about is interspecific interactions. In population ecology, we focus on intra-specific interactions, but this one we're talking about inter, so different species coming together. Intra, if you remember, was animals or organisms interacting within organisms of the same species. Okay. So we're going to focus on two or more individuals from different species interacting with each other. Okay, these can be either negative interactions or positive. Negative meaning that one or both suffer if one of the from the association, even if one species benefits. So, for example, mosquitoes, or in this one, like a fox is eating its prey. That's what you call a negative species interaction. Even though the fox and the mosquito are getting something out of it, that's considered a negative species interaction. That's different than a positive one, where one or both species benefit, but no species are negatively impacted. So for example, a bee and a flower, or a clownfish and a sea anemone, these ones where they both get value out of that relationship. Negative ones, we're going to talk about this really quickly, but some of these you may have heard, and then I know some of you had a bio or AP bio already, so some of this may look familiar to you. Predation, it's when a predator kills a prey, eats a prey for food. Obviously the predator gains, which is awesome, and the prey doesn't, which is negative. Herbivory is similar, same thing, except for it's an animal, it's a plant, where the herbivore gets to eat plants. They get food, nutrition, or whatever, but what's bad is that the plant doesn't get anything out of it. Okay, plants don't grow anymore. Parasites, they consume tissues or nutrients of the host, and then they can also cause diseases inside the host that they are sucking whatever nutrients, blood, whatever from there. Another negative interaction. Interference competition, this kind of looks like a funny picture. It looks like the bird is like kicking or pushing the other bird off this platform here. But interference competition was when one species actively tries to exclude another species from available resources. So if there's one resource and two species want it, like for example, this one looks like to be a location, or maybe it could be food, and I actively try to get you off it or get off my stuff, that's called interference competition. Exploitation competition is when one species more efficiently uses a resource than another one. So it's not necessarily that I'm forcing you out of it or they're fighting for the same thing, but they just exploit or they get more out of it than somebody else does. So this is an example, I guess you could see, of a lion using a resource or getting the prey more effectively than somebody else or another species, but it's not trying to exclude, it's not trying to push the other species away, it just is better at getting that resource than the other species. And the last one you see here is amensalism. This is when one is unaffected and the other one is negatively impacted. Okay, so for example, this black walnut tree, it secretes a toxin that kills plants growing near its roots. So the tree doesn't have any problems with or doesn't get any effect by the plants near it, but the plants near it get to be poisoned and die and eat that toxin. So they're negatively impacted. That's called a negative species interaction. So you may be wondering, what is a positive interaction? Well, there are three types we could talk about. One's called the obligatory mutualism, where both species benefit, and one species cannot survive without the other. So for example, fungi or moss on a tree, they rely on each other for survival, whereas the fungi, so this is fungi and algae. What happens is that the fungi create the food that the algae eat, and the algae gives it like a space to live and things like that, so they both benefit. Facultative mutualism is both species benefits, but they're not necessarily necessary for survival. So again, the clownfish and sea anemone, they benefit from one another, but even if they didn't have each other, they would still survive. Whereas the fungi and the algae, they need each other or else they die. Commensalism is that one species benefits, but the other doesn't really get anything out of it. So for example, a cattle egret, the bird up here, it benefits being on the cattle or being on a cow or bull or anything, but this gigantic cattle, this cow gets nothing out of it, and the bird gets a place to live, it gets to eat stuff off of it, things like that. So that's what they call commensalism. Another thing that you may have read is called the keystone species. What are keystones? The term keystone you may have read about or heard about in bio, but it comes from the thought of there used to be in the olden days an arch, and in these arches there was one stone in the middle, and if you took that stone out, the whole arch fell apart. So that's what they consider a keystone. They apply that philosophy towards species or species that are the main cog of a community. So for example, one of the more famous ones, you don't see it here, but in these pictures you see different food webs. But the famous one that you'll hear a lot of is like, say for example, a sea otter. A sea otter is in the water ecosystem, and it eats sea stars, and not sea stars, it eats sea urchins. Sea urchins, what they do is they eat up all the seaweeds. So if they didn't have sea otters to eat the sea urchins would just eat up all the seaweeds, which means nothing else in the community can have plants to eat. So that's what the example of a keystone. Trophic cascades. Trophic is a fancy word for energy, so like energy levels. Okay, so you may have read, or you should have read, about how energy flows through an ecosystem. Energy flow is controlled by the rate in which energy enters the ecosystem. So you should know that all energy in an ecosystem really generally comes from the sun. Okay, consumption rate by top predators control the abundance and distribution of lower level organisms. So basically, here's an example of a food chain. You have producers at the bottom, like flowers or phytoplankton that do photosynthesis, and at the top you have your consumers, or third level, fourth level consumers, like birds, like sharks, things like that. Okay. Changes in any trophic level can significantly impact organisms at other levels. So for example, if all of a sudden grasshoppers cease to exist, there might be an overabundance of flowers, or the mice that eat the grasshoppers, they die off because there's no more grasshoppers. So that's what we mean by it affects trophic levels. Okay. Plant photosynthesis rate controls the amount of organic matter available within the ecosystem. So these are what really controls the amounts that, it really controls the food chain, basically. Okay. A food web, just so you know, it sounds very logical, but just so that you know, or you're clear about what a food web is kind of like a whole bunch of food chains put together. In the real world, there are food chains, but in the real world, it doesn't necessarily go linearly. So for example, this is an example of a food web. So like a rabbit is eaten by a mouse, which is eaten by a wild cat, but the wild cat can eat the mouse. So basically, that's what a food web is. The top predators consume other organisms, but are not a food source for any other species. Intermediate ones, like here in the middle of the food web, they're both a food source for upper level consumers, and they eat producers. And then the basal species are a food source for all other species, but they themselves don't eat or consume any other species. That's a food web. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about is disturbances and succession. Okay, disturbances actually help species because they can either, again, force a species to adapt, or they can create a whole new habitat. They measure it by the size, the type, the frequency, the intensity, and also the seasonality. The complete pattern of disturbances is called the disturbance regime. Okay, disturbances can be natural, like an earthquake. They could be anthropogenic, which is human or human caused. Okay, it could be exogenous, which means it's outside of the ecosystem, like a fire or a drought or a wind. Or it could be endogenous, which means inside, so like a disease or a pathogen, like people getting somebody else sick. Those are the type of disturbances. Okay. The disturbances are, they develop adaptations. Again, we talk about plants and animals develop adaptations. Like for example, burrowing animals, they survive disturbances with a protective layer of soil. Okay. Many animals survive disturbances by fleeing away from the area. And the adaptations contribute to an ecosystem stability and resiliences to other disturbances. So it's kind of like what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So for example, if people leave a disturbance or something happens and they still survive, that means they're more likely to survive any other disturbances. Okay. Adaptations contribute to something called a term called stability, which means the ability of an ecosystem to survive. And then stability can be measured by the amount of biomass, or what they call resilience, to change despite other disturbances. So this term succession, what that means is that, I know it's a little messed up here, but succession means like the different types of communities that exist after a disturbance. So for example, say you have a ecosystem and you have this gigantic fire. Or let's just say you had this gigantic fire and it has to start from scratch. That's what they call succession. And then from that starting from scratch, now like a forest grows. And then from that, like a more complex forest grows. That's what they call by succession. So after a disturbance or after something happens or a new ecosystem turns into another ecosystem, that's called succession. Okay. The first species to establish after a disturbance is called pioneer species. Okay. So they're usually small, they're herbaceous plants, and they're gradually replaced by taller woody plants. Okay. At the theoretical endpoint of the successions, they call it the climax community, which is a stable community that has very little change from now on. Okay. And the last slide, the road to succession. Succession, the mechanisms are, dependent on both the colonization and survival of new species. Okay. Similar environments undergoing succession do not result in the same climax community. So even though maybe two different communities, they both have a fire, it doesn't mean that they both go towards the same climax community. So there are alternate or alternative stable states. Okay. And then this term gap dynamics, it says that succession can occur in between large disturbance events on a small scale with similar dynamics as larger scale succession. So that's called gap phase, meaning that if there is a small scale disturbance in between very large ones, it can survive, meaning that's why they call it a gap. So a gap in between the very, very large disturbances, there can exist smaller ones and succession can still occur. Okay. So that is section 2. Hopefully you understood. A lot of it, again, is very common sense, I guess you could say, but the questions can trip you up or get very tricky. So I hope you guys understand or feel comfortable with the ecology, and I think you all will do very well. So thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all later.